Hello everyone and welcome to StudyIQ. Since independence, poverty is one of the major pressing problems of Indian economy, and the governments are trying to overcome this issue of poverty by adopting various policies and programs. Today in this session, let us discuss about poverty in India. More than 1/5 of the world's poor live in India alone. So with this we understand the density of poverty in India. So let us try to discuss what are the causes of poverty in India, what are its implications, and what are the measures taken in order to curb this problem of poverty in India. First, let us try to understand who is a poor or what is poverty. Poverty can be of two types. One is absolute poverty and second one is relative poverty. So, absolute poverty means the lack of basic necessities of life. Relative poverty means the income of the person is less than the per capita income of the country. Absolute poverty means the lack of basic minimum requirements, and relative poverty means the income of the person is less than the per capita income of the country. In India, 10% of the poorest people earn less than 10% of the total income of the country. Let us see what are the measurements of poverty. The poverty line. In the pre-independent India, Dadabhai Naoroji was the first person to discuss about the poverty line. He coined the term jail cost of living. So Dadabhai Naoroji was the first person to discuss about the concept of poverty line in the pre-independent India, and he coined the term jail cost of living. In the post-independence India, the poverty line concept came along with the concept of minimum requirements for living. That is the minimum consumption expenditure. The poverty line in India divides the population into two halves, that is the APL and the BPL. APL means above poverty line and BPL means below poverty line. APL consists of those people who have the ability to meet the basic requirements of life, and under BPL the people are not able to meet the basic minimum requirements of their life. In India, it is almost for 1010 and 990. The ratio is like this. Next measurement of poverty is the head count ratio. HCR equal to number of BPL households divided by total number of households into 100. Head count ratio would not give the depth of poverty. Now let us see the poverty line estimates in India. Earlier, the Planning Commission was responsible for the estimation of poverty line in India. So let us see what were the committees set up by the Planning Commission to estimate the poverty line in India. The first committee was in the year 1971-72. That was the V.M. Dandekar and Rath Committee. This was the first committee set up by the Planning Commission in order to estimate the poverty line in India. And this committee came out with a calorie-based poverty line estimation. According to this committee, the minimum calorie requirement was 2250 calories per person per day. And average expenditure to meet this calorie consumption was the definition for the poverty line according to Dandekar and Rath Committee. In the year 1978-79, the Planning Commission had set up another committee, and this committee was known as Alag Committee. This committee also recommended the estimation of poverty line on the basis of calories, but the only difference was that this committee divided it into two. One is rural poverty line and second one was urban poverty line. According to this committee, 2400 calories per day per person was required in rural poverty line and 2100 in case of urban poverty line. In 1993, the Planning Commission had set up another committee to estimate the poverty line, and this committee is an important committee, that is the Lakdawala Committee. Lakdawala Committee recommended a state-wise poverty line. Why? Because the committee said that for every state, the rate of inflation is different. So this committee recommended that inflation must also be considered while estimating the poverty line. This committee said that inflation is one important determinant of calorie consumption, and that is why this committee stands important even now. So this committee included inflation in the estimation of poverty line and recommended that poverty line must be calculated differently for different states, because the inflation rates in different states are different. We still follow the recommendation of this committee when we estimate the CPI for agricultural laborers and CPI for the industrial workers. So this committee recommendation of including the inflation in estimation of poverty line still stands relevant. Now let us see how is a poverty line constructed. The first measurement in constructing the poverty line is that definition must be given by the Planning Commission. Definition given by Planning Commission. Second one, the data regarding the consumption expenditure must be given by the NSSO, National Sample Survey Office. The third step is to construct a consumption basket. This consumption basket will contain a list of food and non-food items which are considered by the NSSO for its survey in consumption expenditure. So, this will contain food and non-food items which are used by the NSSO for the survey in consumption expenditure. The consumption expenditure survey done by the NSSO can be of different types. Let us see what are the methods by which the NSSO can conduct the survey. The first method is uniform recall period. Here the recall period means the reference period. So under the uniform recall period method, the recall period or the reference period is uniform, that is 30 days. The reference period is 30 days for food as well as non-food items. So food and non-food items, the reference period is same, that is 30 days is the reference period for both food and non-food items. That is why it is called as uniform recall period method. Next is mixed recall period. Under this method, the NSSO adopts a mixed reference period. The recall period is the reference period. So, mixed reference period means for the food items, NSSO considers the reference period as 30 days, and for non-food items, the recall period is 365 days. Next is modified mixed recall period method. What is MMRP or modified mixed recall period? So under this method, for certain food items like the perishable food items and luxuries, expensive food items like milk, meat, vegetables, fruits, etc., the recall period is 7 days. For other food items, the recall period is 30 days. And for non-food items, the recall period is 365 days. So that is modified mixed recall period method. And this method is adopted in order to improve the quality of the data. But this is a very difficult method of estimation, sample survey office. And this was used only once by the NSSO. So now let us see some reports of the committees of poverty estimation. First one is Tendulkar Committee. This committee was set up in the year 2005 and gave its report in 2009. The reports of this committee or the recommendation of this committee is the present formula for the data estimation. So this is the present formula for data estimation. Let us understand why this committee was formed in the year 2005. The reason for the formation of this committee, the Tendulkar Committee in 2005, was due to the Indian poverty debate. What is Indian poverty debate? According to the head count ratio in the year 2004-05, 26% of the Indian households were BPL or below the poverty line. 26% of Indian households below poverty line according to the head count ratio report. But during the same time period, that is 2004-05, National Family Health Survey came out with its report, and according to the report of the National Family Health Survey, around 46% of the Indians were poor. So there was a contradiction. During the same period, that is 2004-05, the World Bank also came up with its poverty estimation. According to the World Bank poverty estimation, $1 per day per person was the minimum requirement. So $1. And according to this World Bank estimation, around 40% of Indians were below the poverty line. In the year 2004-05, according to the head count ratio, there were around 26% of people in India who lived below the poverty line. According to the World Bank estimates, it was around 40%. And according to the National Family Health Survey, it was around 46%. So these three figures made a contradiction. So this contradiction is known as the Indian poverty debate, and this Indian poverty debate led to the formation of the Tendulkar Committee. Now let us see what are the important recommendations of the Tendulkar Committee. The first recommendation of this committee was to adopt a uniform poverty line. It means that the rural and the urban poverty line should be based on the same consumption expenditure. The basket of commodities for the rural as well as for the urban poverty line should be the same. The consumption expenditure should be the same for the rural and the urban poverty line. Secondly, the committee recommended for a beyond calorie based poverty line. This means that the committee or the Tendulkar Committee has recommended for calories plus education plus health. The committee said that minimum expenditure on education and health must be considered while estimating the poverty line. The committee highlighted the importance of education and health. The committee said that in a modern society, education and health are also considered as basic necessities. So a minimum expenditure on education and health must be included along with the calories in order to estimate the poverty line. The next recommendation of the committee was to adopt a mixed recall period. What is mixed recall period? We have learned that there are three methods of data collection. One is uniform recall period, second one is mixed recall period, and the third one is modified mixed recall period. The committee recommended to adopt the mixed recall period. Under the mixed recall period, food items are given a reference period of 30 days and non-food items are given a reference period of 365 days. So this committee recommended that the mixed recall period method should be adopted for the data collection. The next recommendation of this committee was to adjust the price differences in rural and urban prices. So these are the recommendations of the Tendulkar Committee. The next important committee is the Rangarajan Committee. This committee was constituted in the year 2012 and gave its report in the year 2014. Let us see what are the important recommendations of Rangarajan Committee. The first recommendation of Rangarajan Committee was to create separate poverty line for rural and urban. If you remember the recommendation of the Tendulkar Committee recommended the opposite. So Tendulkar Committee said that uniform poverty line should be adopted for the rural and urban. But Rangarajan Committee recommended for separate poverty line for the rural as well as for the urban households. The second recommendation of this committee was to adopt a modified mixed recall period. What is a modified mixed recall period? Under modified mixed recall period, the recall period or the reference period for perishable and expensive food items like the milk, egg, vegetables, meat, fruit, etc. are 7 days. Other food items 30 days, and reference period for non-food items are 365 days. So this committee recommended for a modified mixed recall period, but the Tendulkar Committee, as we know, has recommended for a mixed recall period. Next recommendation of the Rangarajan Committee is to give more coverage for food and non-food items. In the Tendulkar Committee recommendation, we saw that education and health expenses were also added along with the calories. But here, under the Rangarajan Committee recommendations, under the food items, calories plus fats plus proteins were added. That means fats and proteins were added along with the calories. And in non-food items, this committee recommended for addition of education plus health plus clothing plus house rent plus conveyance. So the Tendulkar Committee has already recommended for education and health. This committee added clothing, housing and conveyance along with education and health. The Rangarajan Committee recommended for addition of more items into food as well as into the non-food items in the consumption expenditure basket. Now let us see and compare the basic differences between the Tendulkar Committee and the Rangarajan Committee. Firstly, the Tendulkar Committee recommended for a uniform poverty line, whereas the Rangarajan Committee recommended for a separate poverty line. Uniform poverty line means one poverty line for rural as well as for urban. Separate poverty line means separately for urban and rural. The second difference is that the Tendulkar Committee recommended for addition of education and health. The Tendulkar Committee recommended for addition of minimum expenditure on education and health. But the Rangarajan Committee recommended for addition of more number of items in the food as well as in the non-food items in the consumption basket. So, those items were fats, proteins in the food, and in the non-food items, education, health, house rent, clothing and conveyance were added. The next difference is that the Tendulkar Committee recommended for a mixed recall period method of data collection, and Rangarajan Committee recommended for modified mixed recall period method of data collection. So these are the basic differences between the Tendulkar Committee recommendations and the Rangarajan Committee recommendations. These two committees are very important. In India, poverty is not merely because of the lack of income. In many households, we see that they have 3 or 4 times of income than that of the minimum expenditure. But they would be lacking in electricity, safe drinking water, sometimes sanitation. So, Indian poverty is more wider than the income or deficiency in income. Therefore, we have alternate poverty estimation in India. So, let us see what is alternate poverty estimation in India and what are the methods of alternate poverty estimation in India. The first one is socio-economic caste census. Under the socio-economic caste census, the census is taken for the scheduled caste, scheduled tribe population and other households separately. These are based on 7 indicators which include nature of houses, land ownership, adult literacy, etc. The second method of alternate poverty estimation is the multi-dimensional poverty index. Multi-dimensional poverty index. This is estimated by the UNDP, United Nations Development Program. Under the UNDP's multi-dimensional poverty index, 10 indicators are used in order to estimate the poverty level. So 10 indicators are. These 10 indicators are divided into 3 categories. One is health, second one education, third one living standards. Under health, child mortality and nutrition are taken into consideration. Under education, years of schooling and number of children enrolled are taken into consideration. Under the living standards, cooking fuel, toilet, water, electricity, flooring and assets are taken into consideration. So, total 10 indicators divided into 3 categories. So, these are the indicators used in the multi-dimensional poverty index. Here you must understand that all these 10 indicators are excluded from monetary value. They does not have a monetary value. So, it is not based on the income of the households but on other factors. So, any household deprived of any of these 3 or more factors or any of these 3 or more indicators are considered to be poor. So, any household deprived of 3 or more indicators are considered to be poor. During the year 2005-06, around 55% of Indians were poor according to this criteria. The criteria is that if 3 or more indicators are missing from any households, they are considered as poor households. Next we will see an important topic, that is universal basic income. Universal basic income. What is meant by universal basic income? It means that a minimum amount of money is given to every individual within a country or within a demography in a universal manner despite of their employment level, income or education. So, under universal basic income, minimum amount is guaranteed to everyone in a universal manner without considering certain factors like employment, the income level, etc. What is the advantage of universal basic income over direct subsidy? Under direct subsidy, there are certain conditions. For example, direct subsidy is conditional. Example, LPG. When you have to purchase the LPG or the gas cylinder in order to avail the subsidy. So, there are certain conditions. But universal basic income is unconditional. Let us see what are the advantages and disadvantages of universal basic income. First, going on to the advantages of universal basic income. Universal basic income. The first advantage of the universal basic income is that universal basic income helps the government in better targeting. It means that there is less room for corruption. It reaches the beneficiaries. That is, there is more reach. Accountability is more, etc. It also provides more choice for the consumers. It provides more choice. That means the consumers are getting universal basic income. So they are receiving some money. So with that money, they have the choice to purchase the commodities that they like, or they have more choice of consumption. Another important advantage of the universal basic income is that it acts as an insurance against certain risk. Insurance against certain risk. For example, health, education, etc. Suppose in a family there is a sudden expenditure on health. Suppose there is a sudden expenditure on health, and if the government is providing universal basic income, the family can use that amount for the health expenses of that household. So it provides insurance against certain risk. Many developed countries have adopted universal basic income, but when it comes to India, there are certain limitations or challenges in adopting this universal basic income. Let us see what are the challenges. So, challenges in adopting the universal basic income. India is a developing country and we have limited resources. So, providing universal basic income to all the individuals or all the citizens of the country would lead to a wasteful consumption pattern. We must note that the resources in our country are limited. So we have limited resources and our wants are unlimited. We have certain developmental goals. We have social factors to be considered. Our infrastructure must be developed. So for a country like India, which is still developing, we have lots of wants, and the wants can be achieved only through the limited resources which are available in the country. So with this limited resources, if we provide universal basic income, it would lead to wasteful consumption. For a developing country like India, it would not be ideal that we adopt universal basic income, at least until we become a developed country. Universal basic income can also become a moral hazard. It means that, for example, it can become a discouragement for the young population to look for employment. When the government provides universal basic income or minimum income without doing any work, it can become a discouragement for not finding employment or not going for an employment. So this can lead to wastage of human resources in our country. Thirdly, the lack of financial inclusion is a major challenge in implementing universal basic income in our country. Lack of financial inclusion. When we discussed about the challenges in direct subsidies, we said that more than 1/3 of the Indian population does not have functional bank accounts. Even though they have bank accounts through various schemes like the Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana, etc., functional bank accounts are less. So, more than 1/3 of Indian population does not have a functional bank account, and implementing universal basic income like schemes would be difficult without functional bank accounts. Another important cause of concern is the lack of unique identification. Lack of unique identification. We have seen this when we learned about the challenges in direct subsidies. So lack of unique identification in India means that the Aadhaar penetration rate is less in many states in India, especially in the northeastern states. Also, there are challenges of duplication of Aadhaar. So these can act as a hurdle for implementation of the universal basic income in India. Also, the universal basic income is not adjusted for inflation. In an economy which has changing inflation rates, universal basic income cannot be replaced with the subsidies. So, if you replace the subsidies with the universal basic income, what would happen? Universal basic income does not take into consideration the inflation rate, and sometimes the inflation rates can go up and the universal basic income will remain the same. This will be difficult for the households. So subsidies, especially the indirect subsidies, are adjusted for inflation rates. So this can be a major challenge in implementation of the universal basic income. Another important challenge of the universal basic income is that it carries a higher fiscal cost. Higher fiscal cost. What is a fiscal cost? Fiscal cost means the cost from the side of the government or the public purse. So, the cost from the part of government. So, higher fiscal cost means higher government expenditure. In order to implement the universal basic income, the government will have to incur an extra expenditure. That is, whatever the government is incurring for subsidies, the government now will have to increase the expenditure in order to bring in the universal basic income. Universal basic income is near universal. That means almost everyone, every household, every individual will be receiving this universal basic income. So, comparing to the subsidies, the amount of expenditure from the government's pocket would go up, and this will add on to increased fiscal deficit and also increased borrowings from the part of the government. So, this can become a huge public burden or fiscal burden for the government. According to the Tendulkar Committee estimations, the government will have to spend around 4.5% of its GDP if it has to implement a universal basic income. So, 4.5% of the GDP according to Tendulkar Committee. Practically, it would be around 8% of the GDP. Even though the Tendulkar Committee said that it would be around 4.5% of the GDP, practically it can be nearly 8% of the GDP. The government will have to spend around 8% of the GDP for implementing the universal basic income. But coming to the Economic Survey of India, the Economic Survey says that at present the government is spending 1% of GDP for the middle class subsidies. For the food, fertilizers and the fuel, the government spends around 2% of the GDP. Food plus fertilizers plus fuel. Again, the government spends nearly 1.4% of its GDP for the top 10 centrally sponsored schemes. So, altogether 4.4%. See, according to the Tendulkar Committee, the government will have to spend around 4.5% of its GDP for the implementation of the universal basic income. But practically it would be around 8%. The Tendulkar Committee recommended that the government can spend 4.5% of its GDP for the universal basic income if it has to adopt it by compromising on other subsidies. Like, according to the Economic Survey, we said that 1% of the GDP is spent for middle class subsidies, 2% of the GDP is spent for food, fuel and fertilizer subsidies, and around 1.4% of the GDP is spent for top 10 centrally sponsored schemes, which would altogether amount for 4.4%. And according to the Tendulkar Committee reports, around 4.5% of the GDP, around 4.5% of the GDP is what is required for the implementation of the universal basic income in India. But is it practically possible? Let us analyze. Here what has to be noted is, the first thing, the Tendulkar Committee said that around 4.5% of the GDP would be required for the implementation of the universal basic income. But practically this is around 8%. And the second thing to be noted is that if we have to implement the universal basic income, we have to forego the other subsidies, that is subsidies on middle class, subsidies on food, fuel, fertilizers, subsidies for the top 10 centrally sponsored schemes, etc. So, forego all these things. So, this is also not easy in a democracy like India. Can we stop all the subsidies altogether on a fine day? No, it is not practically possible in India. And giving subsidies as well as universal basic income will not be possible for the government. This will have a huge fiscal burden on the part of the government. So, we cannot implement the universal basic income and also at the same time provide the subsidies to the households. So, one has to be foregone. So, considering all these things, universal basic income cannot be implemented in India in a short term. Also, we must understand one important thing. Considering the cost-benefit analysis, universal basic income in India at present would not be recommended. And one important thing to be noted here is that in India, poverty is not only because of lack of income. It is associated with much wider concepts like lack of sanitation, lack of safe drinking water, lack of housing, lack of infrastructural facilities, etc. And providing universal basic income will not be a solution for any of these problems. It can merely provide income to the households in India, and Indian poverty is associated with many large number of causes. For a developing country like India, universal basic income therefore has limited scope.